Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker and today's video is another episode of NBA Trade Machine, and this one covers Bogdan Bogdanovic of the Sacramento Kings. Now if you've never watched this series before, essentially I ask you guys on Twitter for some people that you would like to see in the NBA Trade Machine, and then you send me some trade ideas for them. And typically I would do more than one player, at least 2 or 3, but in this video there's so many different possibilities for Bogdanovic, and I think he's such an interesting trade case that I wanted to go over multiple teams. There's 3 trades that you guys sent to me and then 2 that I made myself. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get into it. First up is going to be a community suggestion from Mr. Murica, and he says Bogdanovic for Tony Snell, Christian Wood, and the Pistons 2020 first round pick. The reasoning is that this trade would work well for the Pistons if they're trying to make a deeper push into the playoffs, and the Kings also get a first round pick for a young asset. Now this is the part of the video that I already can tell I feel like I have to explain how these trades work. So in general, I try and give a pretty good range of trades that are either a lot of value for a player or not very much value for a player, and we just kind of go along that range to give a whole bunch of different possibilities, a whole bunch of different teams that these guys could go to. And for this one, I would categorize this as probably not very much value for Bogdan Bogdanovic. But you also have to consider the context of Bogdanovic's trade situation, which we'll do for all of these trades, and that's that he is a free agent this offseason. So whatever team trades for him will want to make sure that they're going to be able to re-sign him, which will bring down his value. But for this trade specifically, let's look at the Pistons side of things. As was mentioned, this would be a good move for them if they're looking to push towards the playoffs. Bogdanovic would provide them good scoring, good shooting, good playmaking on the wing, which is something that this team needs. They need a boost offensively, especially if Blake Griffin is going to be missing a good amount of games this season. Bogdanovic would be a really good scorer for them, and I think it's possible that he's a player that could be a lot more productive somewhere outside of Sacramento on a team like Detroit that needs the offense that he can provide more so than maybe that Kings team does right now. And they're really not giving up that much. Tony Snell isn't that great of a player. Christian Wood is an interesting young player that's bounced around to a couple of teams, but hasn't consistently shown enough to be a good rotation player to this point, but he's still an interesting young piece. And then the pick as well. I'd like to see some kind of protection on the pick from Detroit, because if you trade for Bogdanovic and it doesn't go super well, and then Blake Griffin continues to miss a lot of games, maybe Andre Drummond gets hurt, this team could potentially be in the top 10 range for their draft pick, and they don't want to trade away that pick without some kind of assurance that it would be protected on the off chance that all of those things do happen that badly for them this season. But still, on the surface, for a player as talented as Bogdanovic, a player that would help them, would fit with their team, this isn't very much to give up at all, assuming there's some protection on that pick. Now for the Kings, on the other hand, for me, this probably isn't enough value for Bogdan Bogdanovic, because they could still get to the end of the season and re-sign him, but the reason that I think that he is a trade candidate right now is just because their season is not going well at all, and his value would probably be better distributed along the roster and maybe building more towards the future than what they have right now, where they'd have to pay him a significant amount and then still not really know how good this team is based off how well they're playing or how poorly they're playing to start this season. But even with that said, and the whole expiring contract thing, this really isn't that much to get for him. Like I said, Snell and Wood are really not that big of factors for me in this trade, and then the pick, if it's unprotected, that makes it more interesting, but I would assume that it would at least be lottery protected from the Pistons, which doesn't help them as much, at least Sacramento as much. So I think they would think about it, maybe depending on some of the other trades, they would potentially pull the trigger on something like this, but in the end, they'd probably just decide to keep Bogdanovic and roll forward with him, re-sign him, and then figure it out later with a potential trade down the road. Moving on now to a trade that I came up with myself, and it's Bogdanovic to the LA Lakers in exchange for Avery Bradley, Alex Caruso, and 3 second-round picks. And this one, I'll admit, is not the best trade that I've ever come up with, and it's mostly just for fun, because I think that this Lakers team is one really good player short of being one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the entire league. I still think they're very good, but they need some other pieces, some significant pieces around LeBron and AD and then Kuzma when he comes back. And I think Bogdanovic would be an interesting candidate for that, and then they could re-sign him in the offseason and continue to help them build towards the future outside of just LeBron and AD. But I'll openly admit that this likely isn't enough for them to get Bogdan Bogdanovic, and they probably don't have the assets to do so because they don't have any first-round picks to trade away, so they have to use seconds, and the players that they do have on movable contracts really aren't that valuable to other teams. But again, I just thought it would be interesting to kind of see how this could potentially work in my head with Bogdanovic on the Lakers. I mean, Caruso, depending on your evaluation of him, is an interesting player. Bradley is more an expiring contract, a veteran presence for this Kings team, and then you get those 3 seconds as well. I looked, if there was a way for the Lakers to give them a first-round pick, I would say that they would probably try and do it, and then maybe that would interest the Kings. But with how all the Anthony Davis stuff went down, it's basically impossible for them to trade away a first. So it would be highly, highly unlikely that the Lakers would be able to make this happen, but I think they would be very motivated to. I think they would try everything they could to bring in Bogdanovic if that was something that was actually available to them. Again, as a scorer, as a playmaker, as a shooter, would be a really good fit for this Lakers team. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem like it's going to be all that possible. Even though this trade technically does work, I doubt it's enough to get Bogdanovic, but still, it's fun to look at, and that's the whole point of trade machine stuff anyway. Moving on now to the other LA team, Jace says that the Clippers would send Mo Harkless and Jerome Robinson to the Kings in exchange for Bogdan Bogdanovic, Caleb Swanigan, and then the Clippers would also send 2 future second-round picks. So let's start with the Clippers here. They're giving up Mo Harkless, who is a okay 3-and-D wing, can defend, can knock down some occasional shots, and then Jerome Robinson, who they're trying to find a role for on this team, but he just is really struggling to get minutes on a team that is this deep and is quickly kind of falling off the radar for the Clippers. And then they're getting back Bogdanovic. Swanigan is really, I would assume, just there for contract filler, but they're getting back Bogdanovic. I've already talked about his value to these teams a couple of different times. He'd be a really good fit with the Clippers and would just further bolster their team's efforts to win a championship this season. This would definitely make them better this year, and then they re-sign Bogdanovic and roll forward as well. Now, for the Kings, really what you're hoping here is that Jerome Robinson ends up being a good player, because everything else really isn't all that helpful. Mo Harkless is an expiring contract, but so is Bogdanovic, so that's really not all that helpful. And then you get the 2 future second-round picks as well. But again, you're just hoping that Jerome Robinson ends up being a good player down the road. The Clippers were very high on him when they drafted him. They just haven't found the developmental minutes for him to put him on the floor, because they've been so good since they drafted him. And now, obviously, this year they've got championship aspirations, so it's tough to find minutes to get him on the floor. I still think he is a talented player and could be good for a team, which is why I think he's going to be a trade piece thrown around throughout the season. But I'm not sure that this is going to quite be enough to get the Kings to pull the trigger, unless they're really high on Jerome Robinson, which, I mean, I guess is possible. Moving on now to the second of the trades that I came up with. This one is the Pelicans receiving Bogdanovic in exchange for each one more and a first-round pick in 2021 from the LA Lakers. So for the Pelicans, this is the first instance of potentially many over the next couple of years in which they could use one of those Lakers picks that they got in the Anthony Davis trade to get an actual player that could end up being really good for them. Bogdanovic and Moore are both expiring contracts. You just swap those 2 players, and essentially the Kings are like, we don't want to pay this guy, we'll take the future first-round pick and deal with it later. Meanwhile, the Pelicans want to add another nice young player to their core. They can afford to re-sign him in the offseason, and then they can just go forward with another really good wing on their roster. The only question I would have here is how confident the Pelicans would be in their ability to re-sign Bogdanovic in the offseason. Like, both of the LA teams would feel confident being able to bring him back, but I'm not sure that that's the case with the Pelicans. Fortunately, Bogdanovic is a restricted free agent, so they'd have the opportunity to match any offers that anyone gives him, but still, that would be a concern for sure. In addition to fit, like, I really like Bogdanovic as a player, and I think he can fit almost anywhere, but this is a Pelicans team that has a couple of talented wings. Brandon Ingram kind of already fills the role that Bogdanovic would hopefully fill there, and he is playing extremely well at the moment to begin this season. So I don't know how motivated they would be to make this move right now, but maybe at the trade deadline, again, they see we have all these picks, we don't know how good they're going to be, let's just give them the 2021 Lakers pick. It's probably going to be one of the last 5 picks in the first round. Let's get Bogdanovic because they don't want to pay him, and then we'll just figure it out later, would kind of be the mindset for me. If I was the Pelicans and if I was the Kings, I would definitely consider this, because like I've talked about in a previous video, the salary stuff is going to get kind of scary for them because of some of the commitments that they've made this past offseason, especially considering how poorly they're playing right now. If they re-sign Bogdanovic, they could be on pace to be a luxury tax team this time next year, and again, not a very good team based off how well they're playing to begin this season. So definitely something I would take a look at from both sides, and this, probably more than any other ones that we've talked about so far, is the biggest win-win trade in my opinion. And then last up is probably, in my opinion, the best trade that was sent to me over on Twitter, and this is from Israeli NBA fan. He says the 76ers would receive Bogdanovic in exchange for Mike Scott, Zaire Smith, and a first-round pick from the 76ers. And the reason I think this is the best one that was sent to me is because the value is probably closest to what the Kings would hope to get and would actually convince them to pull the trigger in a Bogdanovic trade. Smith, I think, is still a good, talented young player that could end up being something for the Kings. Scott is a veteran player that's essentially just an expiring contract in this situation. And then you get the first-round pick as well. Most of these other deals have involved either a player or a pick that would interest the Kings, but in this one you get two. And I also don't think it's too much at all for the 76ers to trade away for a player like Bogdanovic, because they are truly, in my opinion, a championship contender this season, probably the best team in the Eastern Conference at the moment. And if they get Bogdanovic, that's a guy that they can bring off the bench as an outstanding sixth man and can do a lot of the things that this team needs as a playmaker, a scorer, and a shooter, while still maintaining the size that they want to have on the floor pretty much all the time. So this is a really interesting trade, and like I said, probably the best one that was sent to me on Twitter, or probably even better than any of the ones that I came up with as well, depending on your evaluation of Bogdanovic. And also, the only other thing I would kind of question against here is on the 76ers side. They're already committed to like $140 million in payroll 2 seasons from now, because they have the Simmons max, they have the Horford big contract, they have the Embiid max, they have the Tobias Harris max, Josh Richardson making like 10 a year. And then if you add a Bogdanovic deal on top of that, they're going to be paying a ton for this team. But still, I mean, maybe it's worth it if you're winning 60 games every year and you're one of the championship contenders in the league, but that would be a consideration in the back of my mind. Even though I think this is fair value for both teams, from the 76ers, you've got to continue to think ahead about the possibility of paying $155 million on your payroll 2 seasons from now. But with all that said, that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.